Library Subcommittee. It's a great pleasure to have this talk by Sam Dalrymple. Sam's book, if you haven't read it, I hope you will read it after the talk. It's Shattered Lands. It talks about, and it is his first major book, Sam. It's a phenomenal first book. It talks about the partition as we know it, but the partitions before and after the partitions that we know it, and how the partition was an evolving story, starting with different parts of the British Indian Empire being partitioned out of India from what India we know today. This book has been immensely popular. I don't know what is the rank. In many publications I've seen it's the #1 book. And it's after you've bought it, it'll probably hit a higher record. And the way we will do this is Sam will make a presentation for 15 minutes. So especially for those of you who haven't read the book, that will be very relevant. Then I'll ask Sam questions. I've read the book, so I'll ask questions on the book. And then you can ask questions. Hopefully the questions will be about the book. But most importantly, I'll stop you if it's not a question and a comment. Okay, so it has to be a question and not a comment. We know all of us have experience with partition. We have experience with India and Bangladesh. We can share it. You know, if you during the book signing, Sam wants to hear your story, that's fine. But during this talk, we want questions only. But other than that, I'd also start by saying that this is a very personal story for us in Kolkata and I guess other parts of India. Many of us have been affected by it. Many of us continue being affected by it. So, you know, while we have, you know, we might have painful personal memories. So we must ensure that we uphold the Bengal club spirit. The question should be courteous. It's not a political subject. You know, we want to just hear the academic aspect. You may or may not disagree, you may or may not agree, but it's important that this is such a sensitive subject. You know, some of the people who read the book wrote to me, said that I cried reading about some parts of the book. So it is, you know, you have to honor the sensitivity of this. So over to you, Sam.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me at the back? I'd like to begin by just saying thank you all for coming this evening in what is my favorite city in this country. It's so wonderful to see such a packed audience, so thank you all. It really does mean a lot. I'd like to begin the talk with this image on the screen over here. And this fact that I think many of us grow up with the idea that you can see the Great Wall of China from space, and actually you can't. Even if you were to squint your eyes from the International Space Station, you wouldn't be able to see a thing. And that's because there's only one wall on planet Earth that can be seen from space, and that is the India-Pakistan border that you can see over here. That's Karachi, bottom left. And on the right-hand side of the border, we have Jaisalmer and Bikaner. And this is a line created to divide Hindu from Muslim that is visibly etched into the surface of the globe, stretching more than 3,000 kilometers through Sindh, Rajasthan, Punjab, and ending, it transforms this line, this visible line, into the line of control, and it ends just a few kilometers from the second highest peak on planet Earth, K2 in the high Himalayas. It's just one of many extraordinarily militarized borders in this region. If you go further east, the India-Bangladesh border, just near here, is actually the longest wall in the world, the only wall that's longer than the Great Wall of China, because of the way that the border fence wiggles its way so haphazardly through the Bengal Delta. There are more kilometers of fence than anywhere else on planet Earth. And further east, the India-Myanmar border is actually one of the longest borders currently under construction. It wasn't actually fenced until recently, and now I think Amit Shah recently announced that they were going to fence it in the wake of the violence since the coup in Myanmar a few years ago. What's extraordinary is that if you go back 100 years ago to the day that the Victoria Memorial is opened in this city, none of these borders were even conceived of as potentially existing. This is a moment when in Delhi, on the right-hand side, the British Raj is currently constructing, its new imperial capital, the largest architectural ensemble ever attempted by the British Empire. And the Raj is at its height, and it's never been more confident, despite all of these the growing nationalist movement that had particularly been unleashed in the wake of that first partition of Bengal. Still in the 1920s, still as late as 1928, when that famous declaration of Purna Swaraj is made, full independence from Britain. Still then, most British politicians are not considering Indian independence, or indeed any of the countries that emerged from India, as an inevitability. Now, the key message that I want to leave you by the end of this talk is that the India that they're talking about in the 1920s is a fundamentally different one from the one we are used to today. It's actually 2.5 times the size of present-day India, there's no better image to demonstrate this than this image over here. This is a Indian Empire passport. Indian Empire meant anywhere of British India plus any princely state, and it's issued to a Yemeni Jewish woman from the city of Aden in South Yemen, who wants to migrate to Jerusalem after the Balfour Declaration. In order to make that journey, she has to go on an Indian passport, because at the time the entirety of South Yemen is legally a part of India under the 1881 Interpretation Act. You can see again the standard list of princely states that lists Jaipur, Jodhpur, Hyderabad, Kashmir, etc. actually opens alphabetically with Abu Dhabi. Again, not a state that we necessarily associate with India today. It goes on to list places such as Bhutan, that again, we don't usually assume was on that list. And you put it all together, and this is the map of the Indian Empire as it was legally defined under the Interpretation Act. That same year as the Victoria Memorial is opened in this city, 1921. And the story that I'm going to be telling you tonight is the story of how over 5 decades, between 1921 and 1971, 5 partitions tear this gigantic mega colony that contained 1/4 of the world's population, about 580-something princely states and semi-independent kingdoms, and the largest Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, and Zoroastrian populations on the planet. We're going to be telling you how this map turns into this one. 12 independent nation states descend from the Indian Empire, as it was the day that the Victoria Memorial was opened. Yemen, Oman, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar. So I'm going to quickly race through these 5 partitions in the next kind of 10 minutes or so, and then we're going to move into a conversation for the rest of the evening. So the idea of partition obviously begins with the 1905 partition of Bengal, but that's an internal provincial reorganization in a sense. They're not separating anything off from India and making a brand new international border. They're making a provincial border. The first time that idea is floated is with India's largest and richest province, which is Burma at the time. And one just needs to visit Yangon to see this. It's actually, in many ways, a sister city to Kolkata. In a 4-minute walk, you're able to walk from a synagogue that looks suspiciously like the ones in Kolkata, through the Tamil Hindu bazaar, past the Chola Dargah, which the Chola is the word for Tamil in the area because of the Chola Empire, to the Armenian church. And there was so much migration to Burma at the time because it was a province of India, because there were no visas required or anything, that in 1933, an immigration official is able to say that until recently, New York City was the largest immigration port in the world. Today it is Rangoon. And that's why we have songs like Mera Piya Gaye Rangoon, which is kind of memories of this great migration that we've kind of written out of our histories. Many of you in this audience, I'm sure, have family members who spent time in Rangoon. Now, there's so much migration to the city that the first demands for partition begin. And this is very interesting. This is from the Scotsman newspaper. And I just want to focus you on the bottom. Insofar as Burma is an integral part of the Indian system, she has no greater claim than any other part to a divorce. We forget today how integral it was seen to Indian identity and how absolutely absurd the idea of separating it off from India was. I think that we also forget that when Britain conquers the Burmese Empire, the entirety of Assam, Nagaland, Mizoram and Arunachal were part of that Burmese Empire, and that of course many of our, the northeastern states speak Tibeto-Burman languages. There is no obvious border. And this is a recurring thing in these debates. There's no obvious place where one civilization ends and the next begins. They kind of seamlessly float into one another. And so the question of partition divides the country down the middle. You have this man, Mahatma Ottama, who's actually the main Burmese politician in the country. And he leads the Congress in the region, and he basically spends half of his career trying to persuade people that Burma should remain a part of India. But Gandhi disagrees, and Gandhi actually says that the future Indian nation we're trying to forge, it should be based off the contours of Bharatvarsh, this idea that of a kind of cultural unit that was forged in the thousands BC in the Mahabharata. And because the Mahabharata doesn't mention Burma or Arabia, those areas should be cut off. And so on April Fool's Day, 1937, the first partition carves its way through the subcontinent. It's a forgotten partition, and yet it led to a series of xenophobic politicians taking over in Burma, creating a list of Indian ethnicities that need to be purged from the region, notably including Tamils, Punjabis, Bengalis, and the Rohingya, who, on the basis that they spoke a dialect of Bengali, and in a sense that the arbitrariness of that partition border is most visible in the way that half of all Nagas are in India, half of all Nagas are in Burma, and of course that Rohingya, who speak a dialect of Bangla, are now in Myanmar. 366,000 people would be forced from their homes over the course of the next 5 years. And I'm sure many of your families have been part of the Long March, which was the great exodus from that region. Now, the second partition is the partition of Arabia, these Arabian states like Yemen and Abu Dhabi and Dubai that were the last bits really to be added onto the Raj. They're integrated into the Raj. They're initially just kind of protected regions by the British Empire, but other than Aden, that is actually one part of the Raj from the beginning, from 1857. But the rest are mostly integrated in by Lord Curzon, who wants to create a series of frontier states around India to protect it. As a result, you get the Sultans of Oman all being sent off to Mayo College, and many of the dresses that outfits that we associate with the Gulf are actually far more modern than we think, because most of the Gulf elites at the time are actually wearing Shiranis made in the Deccan. Many of the Gulf elites are actually relatives of the Nizam of Hyderabad. This is the family, the Kayati state, who's responsible for the invention of Halim. Halim's a Yemeni dish that was brought to Telangana, mixed with Telugu spices, to create a brand new, incredible dish. But ultimately it's separated off because it's not part of Bharatvarsh, and in particular because the British actually offer it to the government of India in 1946 and it's turned down. Why? The British legation in Tehran writes of the apparent unanimity of government and India officials that they had absolutely no interest in governing the Persian Gulf states after Britain was gone because it would be too expensive to govern these small little desert hamlets. Oil had yet to be discovered, and this is Dubai that year. It's a bit different from Dubai today. Let's skip over that. So there's several legacies include the Khimji family, the only Hindu sheikhs in the Arabian Peninsula, and of course the Ambani family were some of the last kind of Gujaratis to be living in Aden. They'd sort of been there as part of this moment, and they moved back to Bombay in the aftermath of all of this. one of the key things, I'm sure you've heard a million talks about partition, and I'm sure many of your own families have lived through it. There's not that much I can tell you about 1947. One of the key things that I want to emphasize here tonight, though, is this extraordinary fact that the very basis for the creation of Pakistan was the separation of Burma, these earlier partitions. The first pamphlet that ever includes the word Pakistan. It's created by a Cambridge student called Rahmat Ali Chaudhry. He writes, as his justification for its creation, he writes, "It makes no sense to me." This is a paraphrasing. Can't remember off the top of my head the exact quote, but he says something along the lines of, "It makes no sense to me why, if Burma is to be separated from India, then the Muslims of northwestern India must be forced into some sort of Indian federation." His very justification is on the basis of this earlier partition that we've forgotten, and none of the politics of the time makes sense without these earlier partitions. Of course, this demand takes on a movement of its own, and in August 1946, in the wake of the collapse of the Cabinet Mission Plan, which was this last-ditch attempt to kind of create a united Indian federation where Pakistan would have existed as part of an Indian Union, as a bit like kind of, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England are separate nations within the United Kingdom nation-state. So earlier ideas had East Pakistan, West Pakistan, North India, South India, and Deccan as some sort of federation. That falls apart, and in the streets of Kolkata, the first great partition massacres begin on Direct Action Day. This is that famous image from that terrible day. What I think is extraordinary is how last minute all the plans were. This is a photograph from July 1947, 1 month before independence. And it is the Hindustan Times trying to figure out which provinces are going to be part of which country. It's still not clear whether none of the states have voted on partition yet. And so it's still, so the Hindustan Times assumes that Delhi, Shimla, and Kolkata are all going to be part of Pakistan. This is 1 month before independence, and gives you some sense of how rushed these decisions were, and also why, when you speak to people who lived through partition, so many of people talk about not understanding what was happening. This is why. And of course, the greatest migration in human history begins. There is no migration in human history that comes close to the one that was unleashed in the August of 1947. It began actually a bit earlier, from Direct Action Day really, and lasted until 1949. But in that time, somewhere between 10 to 15 million people were forced to leave their homes, and 1 to 3 million people perished in the process. Now, one of the things that I think people find surprising about this book is this fourth partition, which is the fact that what we call the Radcliffe Line is essentially an apt name for the India-Bangladesh border. But he actually only draws about 18% of the India-Pakistan border, because he divides British India. He does it. His pen never touches the princely states, and so this is the map that he creates. This is if you go to the Partition Museum of Amritsar, this is actually the map of India and Pakistan on Independence Day, and it's there on the front cover of the Hindu newspaper in the Partition Museum. Kashmir, Hyderabad, Gujarat, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, Mysore, and much of Kerala are not part of the Indian Union on Independence Day in a remarkable way that, again, we've kind of brush over today. And of course, that's because these 565 princely states had yet to be integrated. Obviously, today, the largest statue in the world is of Sardar Patel, who played a key role in integrating these states over the subsequent 2 years. But it was as late as September 1948, Hyderabad, which is the entirety of Telangana, the entirety of Marathwada in Maharashtra, and much of Karnataka, had yet to be integrated into the Indian Union. So I've actually got a map back at home, which was published in January 1948. And several of these princely states are still, crossed out saying status undetermined. You have maps with that printed, rather fascinatingly. Likewise, Balochistan has yet to join Pakistan yet. And there's the princes themselves. Now, just to finish off before we open up for this discussion, is of course the fifth and final partition, which is the partition of Pakistan itself. in 1971, 24 years later, when Mujibur Rahman wins that famous election in Pakistan, and the military refuses to hand over, the military of Pakistan launches Operation Searchlight, rounding up Awami Leaguers, arresting them, shooting many of the student protesters in the street, and those who resist frequently, coalesce around the group known as the Mukti Bahini, their amazing posters inspired by the works of Jamini Roy and some wonderful photographs from that time. I think that we don't highlight enough the scale. Now, the death toll in 1971 is famously contested because I think Mujibur Rahman claimed it was 3 million and didn't really have any figures to back that up. Meanwhile, the government of Pakistan, to try and push down the number, said it was around 30,000 deaths in 1971, with equally no figures to back them up. What we do know for certain, and what is astonishing, is that in the year 1971, 10 million people, 10 million Bengalis in East Pakistan, future Bangladesh, become refugees in either India or Bangladesh and register with the United Nations as refugees, in either India or Burma, the two neighboring countries. That is 1 in 12 Pakistani civilians became a refugee in that year. And considering that the scale of 1947's displacement was 12 to 15 million, 10 million is astonishing, concentrated in such a small part of the subcontinent. And so I argue in the book that 1971 and 1947 and 1937 need to be seen as the 3 seminal years of rupture in South Asian history, rather than 1947 as the kind of singular moment. And of course, this is that famous photo, the pen that I think it's Nagar and Niazi are using here to sign into existence Bangladesh is, in a sense, signing into existence the 12th of 12 nation states to emerge from what was once one Indian empire. Thank you very much.
That was a lot to take in, and that was phenomenal. I hope everybody got to see the photographs. And if you didn't, we'll have it up here after the talk. You can just go through some of these. But as amazing and unsettling as these photographs are, the book has many, for every photo, there are anecdotes that I'm sure Sam could have talked about if it was an hour-long talk. Like even the last photograph with Niazi and Manekshaw. No, I'm saying in Aurora and Niazi, but in Manekshaw and Niazi were together in the Battle of Manipur, and awarded recognition for their contribution during the Battle of Kohima. When you're talking about, and this is in this book, when you're talking about all the connections between these people, Ayub Khan was also there in the same Battle of Manipur. So it's a fascinating history, and I hope that some of you would read the book. But my first question, when we say that we didn't realize what India meant, the question to me is, you talked about the Interpretive Act of 1881, which essentially says all regions under the Viceroy is India. So that meant Yemen, and all these people, as Sam said, had the Indian passport, used the Indian rupee. But does that make a nation? Did they feel Indian?
This is precisely the great question that people are debating at the time. There is a kind of series of forgotten debates from the 1920s on what constitutes a nation. And in some sense, Gandhi saying that there is this cultural thread united in the region south of the Himalayas and north of the ocean called Bharat, that does have this kind of cultural thread running through it. But these other places are essentially tacked on by imperialism. What's interesting is the extent to which people at the time do argue that, you know, this is one of many interpretations and many ways that the nation and building project could go. So there is that guy I mentioned earlier, Mahatma Uttama, who spends the second half of his career desperately, as a Burmese person, desperately trying to argue that Burmese people are Indians and that the Indian nation does extend here. After all, you know, Buddha's followers came from Bihar and spread Buddhism to Burma. You know, after all, the languages of northeastern India are the same cultural family of languages as those in Burma. Any chance we could turn off the screen, because it's, yeah. Likewise, in Yemen, there is this fascinating figure called Muhammad Ali Luqman. He's later one of the founding fathers of Yemen. But in the 1920s, he is essentially working, he's Ambedkar's travel buddy. He is Gandhi's Arabic translator for when Gandhi wants to address the Arab wing of the Indian National Congress in Yemen. Because, of course, the year of the Great Salt March, 1 year beforehand and 1 year afterwards, so it's kind of a 2-year period, really. He begins that period in Rangoon. He visits Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Yemen in that period, and addresses Congress groups in each country. So Muhammad Ali Luqman spends time arguing that actually Arabs are beginning to develop an Indian consciousness, and there is potentially a future where Arab is considered an Indian ethnicity alongside Punjabi, Bengali, Telugu, Kashmiri, etc. And so I don't think that most people living in rural Dubai would have ever thought of themselves as Indian. They would have thought of themselves as Khaliji, Gulfi, kind of basically, or Arab. But gradually in the great metropolises, some people were beginning to think this. And I think that that is the key thing, is that, you know, a lot of this is in some sense that the longer that you're part of the same country, the more cohesive it begins to feel. And I think that, you know, in some sense, even, you know, what Northeast India was grappling with similar questions at the same time, you know, at the same time as Burma, the Burmese are considering, can we be Indian? So are the Nagas. And, you know, we have seen that play out in real time in a series of insurgencies where half of the population were considered that Nagas could be Indian, and then there were other people who believed that they couldn't. So these questions are intensely debated in ways that we've forgotten. And equally, there are a series of, you know, forgotten demands that, you know, for example, for the re-establishment of a Sikh empire, for the re-establishment of the Maratha empire, for the re-establishment of the Nawabs of Awadh. So alongside these demands for the establishment of an Indian nation, there are a series of smaller ones which are essentially harking back to these pre-colonial ideas that are also there, that also get brushed aside. And I think that that's, there's actually a lot of people in Darjeeling, for example, who are wondering whether they're going to be handed back to Bhutan, because after all, Darjeeling had been part of, the Bhutanese kingdoms for some time. And so there's far more in question in the 1920s than we are familiar with. And reading those debates is fascinating and rather unsettling.
It's absolutely fascinating. And some of the stories that I read from your book, like Mahatma Uttama, he was the president of the Hindu Mahasabha, the only non-Hindu to be president of Hindu Mahasabha. In 1837, Veer Savarkar replaced him as the president of Hindu Mahasabha. It's fascinating that, you know, can you imagine like what is happening in history and, you know, how we forget. And also, you know, as you read the book, you start seeing a hinge in 1937. And you know, you can go back from, you know, we are familiar with the 1905 Bengal partition. Obviously, the massacre in Jallianwala Bagh, you know, which, you know, challenges the notion that there can never be British rule over India. Yeah. The First World War, where millions of Indians fought abroad and came back to a nation where they were colonized and they felt, you know, things must change. But 1937 was an interesting year, rather than the fact that Uttama was replaced by Savarkar. It was the year that Burma was partitioned. Yemen was partitioned. It was essentially the first major partition. And before that, about a decade before that, was the Simon Commission. As I was reading the characters of the Simon Commission, all British, there were names like Cadogan, which we've seen in London, in Cadogan Square, basically landed gentry who had completely no sense what was happening in India. And the letters that they were writing, they visited tea estate in Tinsukia and playing tennis while the country is basically falling apart. And the way they decided Burma is going to be out of, what caused the shift, from a period of, Victoria Memorial. Yeah. Basically, the Taj Mahal and, the British rule is unquestioned and permanent to 1937 when they start getting challenged. And from there, 1947 seemed only a matter of time.
Sure, I think that there's a series of nationalist movements that kind of break out in tandem, the most famous of which is Gandhi, but Ottama is likewise leading similar protests against British rule, inspired by Gandhi, but kind of doing his own thing, notably against one Craddock, who I saw on the list of Bengal Club presidents, was one of the presidents of here. So Burmese nationalism begins by protesting against the head of the Bengal Club, which is a rather fascinating connection. But in some sense, so it's a series of things. I think one of the key things is World War I eviscerates the economy. And then you have the Great Depression, which, particularly in Burma and this region, we forget the extraordinary impact of the Great Depression. We've seen the cultural changes that have followed 2008 and our most recent financial crash. I think very similar kind of frustrations that were building up burst in the wake of the Great Depression. Notably, the entirety of, whether Burma is going to be separated or not is very much in question in the 1920s. And it's in the wake of the Great Depression that it isn't. Why? If any of you have been to Chettinad, you will know that there's gorgeous Burmese teak mansions. These are the Chettiars. They were the main bankers in the region, in Burma. Now, when the Great Depression happens, all these farmers, all these rice farmers, simultaneously default on their debts. And unable to get repayments, the Chettiars begin basically buying up land. So that in the course of about 6 years, I think it's kind of a quarter of Burmese land or something like that gets bought up by the Chettiars. And suddenly all these questions about kind of can we feel Indian or not take on very real economic peril, that we are being bought out by Indian migrants, essentially. And suddenly the debate changes into a far more racialized one. Notably around the same time, as a result of the Great Depression, there is a rebellion in Burma called the Sayasan Rebellion. It's the largest rebellion against British rule since 1857. Interestingly, its rebels are actually communicating with the rebels in the Chittagong Armory raid, which happens the same month, which is very big in Bengali history. So these rebels are all working together. But everything changes when the British send the Indian Army in, because the Indian Army is mostly Kashmiri, Punjabi and Pashtos, and suddenly these guys in turbans who don't look anything like the Burmese are suddenly going around and shooting up the villages. And so suddenly, in the course of about 4 years from the Great Depression, the entire politics of the state has changed. Suddenly everyone feels that kind of not only the British, but the Indians have to go too. And things really begin to change from there. So I think, that in some sense is a microcosm of the changes which the Great Depression wrought on the region. And then, of course, World War II happens. And I think World War II is the great thing that no one talks about in the fall of the Raj, because suddenly you see the Japanese, an Asian power, defeating Britain in Hong Kong, in Singapore, and sweeping through Burma, and Subhas Chandra Bose fighting alongside them. And suddenly, everyone feels that this whole lie of kind of white supremacy, etc., is suddenly revealed out in the open.
That's fascinating, and the way you describe it is also very interesting. Sam says it took to partitions to make the notion of undivided India. After Yemen was taken out and Burma was taken out, then we see the notion of India as we think of undivided India, which includes Pakistan, but does not include Burma, does not include Yemen.
Undivided India was created by dividing India.
Yes, and it's an interesting song, and the song Bande Mataram, in 1937, became the national song of India. The whole notion of the separation of Burma. At that time, the book shows quotes from Ambedkar and Chaudhry Rahmat Ali, the person who did was a Muslim League member and anagram of Pakistan. They start, Ambedkar says, if Burma is divided, how would other regions not be divided? That's quite fascinating, that the whole notion of this is something that is divisible, became very apparent. Now, as we move forward from 1937 to the 1947, and you talk about the separation, those 10 years, the rise of Muslim League, which was almost inconsequential can you describe that? You've written that quite significantly in the book.
Which the rise of the Muslim League in general?
In the 10 years before the 1947 independence.
Sure. So I think the Muslim League is very much around from, I think it's 1905, correct me if I'm wrong, that it's formed in Dhaka, it's formed in Bengal, and it's in some sense the kind of Muslim nationalism begins in India's most populous Muslim province, which was Bengal, or Muslim majority province, sorry. So in 1937. The Muslim League loses everywhere, and then in the Lahore resolution,
including in Punjab,
including in Punjab, and
everything.
Jinnah, I think, says that I'm never going back to Punjab. It's such a hopeless place. Initially, Jinnah finds Chaudhry Rahmat Ali's idea of Pakistan, he calls it a kind of Walt Disneyan nightmare, a kind of Wellesian hellscape. But eventually he begins to come round in the wake of a series of massacres of Muslims that mainly happened in UP, and then in particular, the massacres of Muslims that were happening in Burma. Again, it's Burma that is inspiring all of this. He comes round to this idea that Muslims need legal protections, and the crucial thing was that having separated off Burma and the Arabian Peninsula, you'd essentially separated off all of the non-Hindu majority bits, and in a sense made Hindu domination a possibility for the very first time. And that had not been the case when Yemen and when Burma had been part of it. And so suddenly there's a growing fear, and you begin to see it in the elections with increasing numbers of people signing up to the Muslim League. He announces in 1940, the idea that India should be divided into into separate nations. That separate nations should be established from Muslim majority regions. What's interesting again is how much the great question of what he's actually trying to do, whether he's trying to pitch some sort of UK-style system or whether in these early days he's actually seeking a separate nation state. But I think one of the things that we overlook is how much the Quit India movement and the entirety of Congress being arrested in World War II for the Quit India movement is an unexpected boon to Jinnah, because he's able to basically canvass for votes for the next 3 years with no political opposition because they're all in prison. This is hugely consequential, and I think that there's a quote, I can't remember, I think it's Woodrow Wyatt, who's an MP from Britain, who basically says, Nehru, when he was released from prison after World War II, just wasn't able to be convinced that the Muslim League was an actual political force, because he'd been in prison for so long that he'd missed the entire rise of the Muslim League, essentially. It had all happened in the course of World War II. And so it took about 2 hours of persuading Nehru and Patel, etc., that this great political change had actually happened.
But isn't that surprising, given that Patel was getting intelligence?
That's later.
Later.
That's later. So Patel, in the interim government, is put in charge of the interim government's intelligence in 1946, so a year later. But all these guys were arrested. I think they're put in Ahmednagar Fort. You can actually go to Ahmednagar Fort in Maharashtra and see the cells where they were all locked up. And it's because of the fact, in a sense, that they were locked up for so long that they were away for the great political rise of the Muslim League and the rise of the Pakistan demand. And I think, in some sense, why they weren't able to counter it as effectively.
It's fascinating also that in the book I read that India and Pakistan continued sharing intelligence. And it sounds so bizarre that sharing intelligence, and especially the worry was communism, which was becoming a factor in Burma. And you say that it was the capture of Goa, which set off Ayub Khan.
Yeah.
And that was, can you describe that process?
Sure. So this is really new, kind of essentially post-COVID research that has completely changed a lot of what we thought about the 1950s. There's two particular scholars that I have to mention. Avinash Paliwal, who wrote an amazing book called India's Near East, and then Pallavi Raghavan, who wrote a book called Animosity at Bay. And it's basically utilized a whole new range of declassified intelligence files from both India, Pakistan, and also the UK, which have only been released in the last decade or so. And they reveal this fascinating fact that after the I think it's the Nehru Liaquat Pact in 1949, where both countries, after partition, basically agreed to look after their own minorities and stop any further violence. After this, things get back on track remarkably quickly, so that by 1950, the predecessors of the ISI and RAW are sharing intelligence with one another in Burma and in the northeast in the Chittagong Hill Tracts to basically stop communist infiltration from China, because, China had just become communist. There was this big fear with the rise of the Cold War that was the new big threat. And so there's this, in some sense, if you saw the film Pathan, where kind of, Shah Rukh Khan and Deepika Padukone are the kind of ISI and RAW agents who are working alongside one another, that is the case in Burma in 1950 to kind of 55, in a way that we've completely forgotten. And even the late 40s. There's this whole fascinating story. And there are joint Indo-Pakistani passports that are issued. An Indian Muslim is brought in to build the tomb of Jinnah as an act of as a peace offering. And there is this kind of great hope in the 1950s that we've forgotten that we will be able to move past the horrors of partition. Obviously, there are still traumas, there's still killings occasionally breaking out, but there is, at least in the governmental level, this attempt to finally work alongside one another. The dispute over Kashmir is basically put on hold. They're like, we'll figure this out once we've actually stopped the chaos that we've unleashed. So there's this amazing decade that I still see as a kind of rather hopeful sign, to be honest. And what these new intelligence files seem to suggest is that when India goes into Goa and the liberation of Goa in 1961, Goa was Portuguese at the time, Ayub Khan, the Pakistani leader, becomes convinced that India suddenly, now that it's back on its feet, partition's over, the economy's reviving, now that it's back on its feet, it's got all these irredentist claims and is trying to reclaim a greater India. And that will inevitably end up, what begins in Goa, he thinks, will end with Nehru trying to reconquer Pakistan. And that seems to be the first moment that Ayub Khan, according to these documents, begins extending funds not to Kashmiri separatists, but to Naga and Mizo separatists. And it's that funding that RAW eventually, or the IB, its predecessor, begins to figure out is happening. They begin to figure out that kind of Pakistan is funding these dissidents in the northeast. And so they then begin reaching out to Bangla separatists in in Dhaka, and this whole process between about 1961 and 1964, the entire goodwill basically entirely breaks down, so that by 1965 they're at war again. And what's extraordinary is how much in the 1950s that could almost have been averted. I don't want to say it completely could have, because they had yet to actually sort a lot of the great question marks out. But there was, for example, they had made great strides in resolving border issues. Notably, Firoz Khan Noon, the last democratically elected Prime Minister of Pakistan before that first coup, he resolves many of the border disputes with India, and the coup actually happens when he's trying to finally address Kashmir. So yeah, there's all sorts of kind of alternate possibilities, and it's fascinating how much new archival sources can challenge decades of what we've thought, in a sense.
So Sam and I were up in the library looking at some of the books which actually talk about Burma, written in 1940, 1939, pointing out the Indian question of Burma. We also looked at the transfer of power, and some of the things that 12 volumes of transfer of power. Some of the sections of the transfer of power, like on 14th August, I like reminding Mitakshara, 14th August, the Maharaja of Jodhpur had actually talked about joining Pakistan. And his mother said that, don't take him seriously, told the region, don't take him seriously. And that's how, it's how, it's what we think as settled fact today, and the inevitable nations of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Burma. And our origin myth, you go to Burma, there's an origin myth of Burma. You go to Dubai, there's an origin myth of Dubai. But there was nothing inevitable about this.
So firstly, I think just on the subject of princely states, I think we forget that the only border state that announced well ahead of time that it was definitely going to join the same country as, its religion would suggest, was Bikaner. So Bikaner in Rajasthan very early on says we're going to join India. But Bahawalpur and Khairpur, that later join Pakistan, are all in negotiations with India to see what sort of deals they can get. Jodhpur and Jaisalmer are chatting to Pakistan to see what they can get. What's interesting, Manipur briefly negotiates with Burma to see what they can get. And ultimately they make their decisions based on often economics rather than religion. And I think we lump together the partition of British India, which happens on religious lines, with the partition of princely India, which often happens on economic lines. And the best example of this is that many of the states of the Khasi states that now form south of Shillong in Meghalaya actually get in touch with Pakistan and say, we're neither Hindu nor Muslim. We are right next to Sylhet, and we will go with whichever way the Sylhet referendum goes. And when Sylhet referendum goes in favor of Pakistan, they're like, okay, we're going to join Pakistan. And Pakistan never gets back to them. And there's this file that a scholar in Pakistan called Yaqub Bangash found, which is basically 3 months after independence. Some Pakistani officials find that several of the Khasi states actually tried to join Pakistan, but the paperwork got lost. And after 3 weeks of not hearing from the Pakistani government, the same Khasi states get in touch with Sardar Patel and say, we'd like to join India, please, because these Pakistanis aren't getting in touch with us, and we've just not heard back. And so much of modern Meghalaya is a result of lost paperwork in some sense. And the Jaintia Hills are in Meghalaya today, but Jaintiapur, which was the biggest Jaintia city, is today in Bangladesh. So, the economics would have suggested that these kind of, animist and Christian states could have joined whichever one suited them economically. On the topic of inevitability, I think it's interesting how much each of these partitions has a kind of a sliding doors moment. So I think until the Great Depression, the partition of Burma is not an inevitability, but after the Chettiars buy up all the land, and after the Indian army's been sent in to quell this rebellion, it does become an inevitability. I think that before Direct Action Day, the creation of Pakistan in its current form was not necessarily an inevitability, but afterwards it is. Before Operation Searchlight was launched by the Pakistani government, in independent Bangladesh was not necessarily an inevitability. Afterwards, it becomes one. So I think each of these moments, there's a sliding doors thing, and we forget how much it's a series of conscious decisions and chance that has created the geopolitical map that we see today.
Great. So I'll open up the questions for all of you, but would you read the last paragraph of your book? I think it's very...
Sure. So it ends with the words, "Today the divides across South Asia grow ever wider. Politicians still stoke the embers for their own ends, with the now nuclear-armed nations of India and Pakistan continuing to teeter on the brink of all-out war. In Burma, the military maintains its assault on the Rohingya minority, and at the time of writing, the Indian government was planning to fence the Indo-Burmese border, one of the last unfenced borders in the entire region. The last decade has witnessed the decline of globalization, the strengthening of borders, and the resurgence of nationalism across the world. India's partitions are a dire warning for what such a future might hold."
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a fascinating book. I'm sure there's lots of books. We brought 75 books. So whoever wants to buy it can get it signed, or if you've bought it before, you can get it signed. Questions from the audience? Manojda. Mama.
Can we get the microphone? Yes. There we go. Hello.
Sam, I must compliment you. I must compliment you on the way you've covered the entire region and its partition. I won't go into a comment, but specifically, because Rudra has warned against that, but specifically, Nepal was never directly ruled, as I understand, nor was Bhutan, right? Why then, given the similar kind of expedition that was led against Nepal or Bhutan, you had the same with Tibet, with Young Husband in 1903, 1904. Why did Tibet then slip through the cracks and leave the mess that we are now saddled with?
Brilliant question. Thank you so much for that. So firstly, on the status of Nepal and Bhutan, they have this very interesting status within the Raj, that is the only comparable other state that has the same status within the Raj is Oman. And actually not Bhutan, it's Nepal and Oman that have this status, where they both have legal treaties that confirm their independence, but are de facto princely states in the sense that the Indian political service is there, the legal system is put in place. People from those regions are eligible if they so choose for Indian passports, although they are allowed their own as well. And the Indian currency is often used. Although, again, many princely states didn't use the Indian currency. Notably, Hyderabad did not use the Indian rupee as late as 1947, and neither did Nepal. So it's this funny legal position that contradicts the Interpretation Act. And thus, within British documents at the time, there's a brilliant scholar called Swati Chalwa, who is currently working on this, the fact that everyone knew that Nepal's independence was kind of there on paper, but that it was a de facto princely state. And it actually shows up in the list of princely states, interestingly, as a what's it called? An informal princely state, it's known as. And it shows up on the 1909 maps of the Raj as a standard princely state alongside Bhutan, interestingly. Tibet doesn't, because the British presence there is only a kind of high commission. The Indian political service is never sent into action, essentially. It's not what happens with these other states is basically Lord Curzon. Lord Curzon builds this web of frontier states and attempts to integrate them as princely states, and these places that were often previously not princely states. And so all of these kind of informal arrangements are made under Curzon. If you go to his house in Kettleston Hall in the UK, you can actually see the Maharajas of the Delhi Darbar, etc. You'll notice that the Sultan of Muscat and Oman, as well as the Ranas of Nepal, all show up alongside the Indian Maharajas. That's because of this attempt to try and Indianize them and make them part of the princely state system. They were always kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And at Swati is working at the moment on how they actually have to do a legal case to prove their independence in 1946. There's a whole legal case that has been forgotten where Nepal and Bhutan basically say, look, we had this treaty saying that we were not part of the Raj, you've got to give us independence. because this was always an informal arrangement. There was nothing official about this, and the fact that you put us on your maps and coloured us yellow on your maps and invited us to the Delhi Darbar confirms nothing. But it's an interesting, weird legal loophole. Crucially, Lord Curzon did not extend that to Tibet, because that was more of an expedition thanks to young husband kind of charging in and going out. There was no permanent residency that was set up in Tibet. So you know how there was a Hyderabad residency and a Rajputana residency, etc. No residency was ever set up in Tibet. They considered it, and had they actually gone through with it, it would have been in the same position.
And also there was a Tsarist Russia by that time, the great game between so it wasn't as easy.
My name is Rupen.
Hello.
I have a question on the Radcliffe Award. I come from Murshidabad, and 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th, Murshidabad was part of East Pakistan.
Yeah.
He actually writes that in the book. Oh. Not Lalgola, but he writes about Murshidabad.
18th, although Murshidabad is a state which has got district which has got a majority of Muslim population, for some reason, Radcliffe changed his mind. Do you have any inside track as to why it happened?
Yes, actually, and there's quite a lot in the book on this. This is actually a topic that I was very keen to go into in depth. What seems to have happened wasn't that he changed his mind. It was that in the lead up to partition, basically everyone assumed that the districts that were given either side would follow majority-minority religions, essentially. The brief that Radcliffe has given is that is essentially that he has to choose which country is going to get which area based off religious minority and majority, but also what will make a state viable. And the crucial thing is that Chittagong was going to be the main port of East Pakistan, largest port in Bengal, I think. And in order to make it a viable port, it needed to have a hinterland. So Radcliffe gives 98% Buddhist and animist Chittagong hill tracts to Pakistan, and in exchange gives Murshidabad to India as a kind of swap, essentially. Likewise, I think that there are a couple, I think it's Firozpur district, which is given to India, and then another of the Punjab states that was Sikh majority is actually given to Pakistan. Nankana Sahib, I think it is, the birthplace of Guru Nanak. It's not that it became one thing and then changed. Remarkably, the Radcliffe line was only actually announced on the 18th of August 1947, 3 days after independence, according to Mountbatten, so that basically Britain could get out and so that the blame wouldn't be on them when everyone protests. He wanted a day of celebration where he could be in the press and have a look like a positive transfer of power, and then all hell would break loose 3 days later. So many of the governments basically go into position assuming that these places are going to be part of their jurisdiction, and then they find out 3 days later that they haven't. But there's a particularly poignant part of the book. There's a incredible Punjabi satirist called Fikr Tonsfi, who's one of the great writers of partition, up there with Manto. And he writes of this extraordinary scene on 18th August 1947, sitting in Lahore and listening to a radio where they're listing which cities have ended up in which countries, because there was no published images yet, and he and his friend, who's a Muslim friend, he's Hindu, his friend's Muslim, and they are using they bought a map from the bazaar, and they're trying to figure out where the border actually is, and they're in Lahore, and they're unsure on the 18th which city they are in. Interestingly, the reason that Karachi was the first capital of Pakistan was solely decided on the basis that it was the only city that they were certain was going to be part of Pakistan. Because Northwest Frontier Province was going to vote, Balochistan was a princely state and so wasn't yet part of it. Punjab and Bengal were both going to be partitioned, and no one had any idea which bits of which province were going to be part of which country. And as a result, it was only Sindh that a month in advance they could be certain was entirely going to be part of Pakistan. But yeah, thank you for that question.
Another thing, when the British left India, they had this view that empire had become too expensive to run. Now the thing is, if we look at the work of Shashi Tharoor and others, so a lot of money over the colonial period was transferred from India to Britain. So the question is, so what happened in 47? Was there no more money to be made? Had it become totally dry? The system had pulled it out? What was it?
Brilliant question. So the basic thing is the Blitz. So the Blitz destroyed Britain. And World War II destroyed Britain, and ultimately the British Empire partly collapses thanks to the Blitz. So, Coventry's razed to the ground, half of London is bombed. So much so that in the course of World War II, I think by the end of World War II, I can't remember the exact figures off the top of my head, but Britain actually becomes in debt to the government of India because using Indian loans to try and rebuild post-Blitz Britain. And there's this extraordinary legal case where not all of the loans were actually ever paid off, and there's this demand much later that Britain essentially still owed India some money, I think, until quite recently, as a result of the loans that it took out during World War II. So Britain is basically just made broke in the course of the war. It's so expensive. They, bear in mind, lost half of the empire. So, a lot of the key money makers in empire were places like Malaysia and Burma and Hong Kong that had been conquered by the Japanese during World War II. At the same time, the huge death toll, the payments to soldiers, etc. So it's World War II that bankrupts Britain and makes independence. I think by the late 30s, they were aware that independence was coming, but there were still people talking about potentially it was going to happen by the 60s or something, potentially in 3 decades' time. And then World War II massively speeds it up, essentially. But I hope that answers your question, sir.
Yes, but if there were loans to be repaid, and if it continued as a colonial country, then they would have remained unpaid. So,
Yeah, no, I agree.
I'm sure many loans are still unpaid.
Can you pass the mic to this lady over here?
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think there's someone
on the subject of the UAE, Oman, and Yemen being part of the Raj, was that purely a matter of administrative convenience? Because all the other countries, like present-day countries that were part of the Raj, they at least had you could at least use the reasoning of geographical proximity, but Oman and the Arab countries were across a whole other sea, whole other different language spoken, different culture. And was that only because the other Arab countries now they're countries like Palestine and Syria, etc., were under the control of the Ottomans? So whatever the British got, they just said, okay, let's stack it onto India because we've already got administration there. So
it's there is a fascinating amount of work happening at the moment. Partially yes. But there's also a fascinating amount of work that is on early 20th century thing, which is basically that region had actually always been looking towards India rather than the rest of the Arab world. These states are separated from the rest of the Arab world by one of the biggest deserts in the world, which is the empty quarter here, right? And so they're essentially if you imagine them as an island in the middle of a water sea and a desert sea, they'd always been looking both ways. And actually, across this region, throughout the pre-colonial period, the second biggest language was always Gujarati, followed by Sindhi. And so the presence, in some sense, the present state of affairs is far less unusual than we tend to think. It often comes as a surprise when you actually look into the region's pre-colonial history, for example, that one of the earliest known kings of Kerala is buried in Oman, and that at the same time as we are today very aware in some sense of the sheikdoms of the Gulf, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, etc., we forget that there were also Arab sheikdoms across what's now Gujarat. Mangrel, the Sheikh of Mangrel. There were about 15 different sheikdoms that were also in Gujarat and Maharashtra. And, you know, Janjira was a state in Maharashtra that was ruled by a bunch of Ethiopians. And in a sense, this whole Indian Ocean littoral, the kind of coastal region, was far more culturally diverse and mixed than I think we tend to imagine. And it's only thanks to Arab nationalist kind of literature that came out in the 1950s and 60s that we now imagine that entire region as having been this kind of pure Arab civilization that was cut off from India. As I showed you in that photograph, I think the best example of this is this family, okay? So the Qayati family are, without a doubt, the most fascinating family that I interviewed in this entire book. So the Qayati family are a bunch of Arab mercenaries in, I think it's the 17th century. They come out to India from what's now Yemen as mercenaries, and they first get into the hire of the Marathas. They later are hired by the Nizam of Hyderabad, and they later become Jemedars of the Nizam of Hyderabad. So they actually become Zamindars. If you go to Medipatnam cantonment, that's actually the old estate of the Yemeni sultans. So they then, from Hyderabad, as vassals of the Nizam, go and conquer their own kingdom back in Yemen. And this entire region of Yemen, eastern Yemen, called Qayati state, is ruled from Hyderabad for about 150 years before the British even show up. So these are the guys who introduce Halim, and these are the guys who are all wearing shirwanis rather than the kind of thobe and the Arab headdresses that we know today. So in a sense, this is the pre-colonial dress of Yemen, not the dress that we see today. There are perhaps the best example of early links is the fact that Socotra, which is an island in modern-day Yemen, is actually derived from the Sanskrit Sukadvara, because it was one of the great places where Indian traders traded with the Arab mainland from way back. So again, Gujaratis mainly, and Sindhis. But so this Indo-Arab world is one which disappeared in the course of the 1920s, and what's so interesting is Muhammad Ali Luqman and others imagining an India where Arabs are an ethnicity of India. Now, that being said, this is definitely the region where the least people ever felt Indian. 99% of people, if you asked them in the 1920s, could you imagine yourself part of India? They would have probably said no. But the elites often thought otherwise, and there was this kind of growing sense in elite centers that potentially things would change and they would become part of this Indian identity. So it's a kind of yes and a no. It's definitely the place that was least connected, and that sea distance was massive, and I think ultimately unbridgeable. But there are enough fascinating kind of memoirs and bits of research that pointed other futures. And I think perhaps the best example of this is the fact that today, if you go to Oman, there are different sheikhs of different communities, different tribes. And one of the tribes there is called Al-Balochis. Another is called Al-Lawatiyas, who are all Sindhis originally. And then the other is Sheikh Khimji of the Al-Banyan tribe, the Banyas. And so Banyas, today by the Omani government, are recognized as an indigenous Arab tribe of Oman. and he is the only Hindu sheikh in the Arab peninsula. So there are it was possible to imagine other futures, would be my answer, rather than saying, yes, there was a possibility of this actually happening. There are some people imagining things going other ways. Thank you.
I think there's a question from the back, which is, I can't see the gentleman. Yes, please. We'll get the mic to you. And then the last question from you, ma'am, and then we'll close this.
So, hi. You, in your book, you've suggested that the United Kingdom model, it was possible in India if Nehru and Gandhi had agreed to, or not insisted on Northwest Frontier Province not being a part of Pakistan. can we extend the thought? Is it possible that if they had actually not asked for it, Jinnah would not have insisted on a Pakistan as late as the late 1946, and that India would have continued as this united kingdomish place with many different regions which were all a part of the same country in some shape or form?
I think so. For those who haven't read the book, I mentioned earlier this cabinet mission plan that pictures this United Kingdom style system. And it falls apart ultimately for a bunch of reasons. The Peshawar thing that I mentioned in the book is one of 5 reasons, and I say that's the final stumbling point that makes it fall apart. But there's actually, I mentioned in the footnotes, there's kind of 8 other reasons or something. But it gets so close, and I know that every single person who researches the cabinet mission plan that I've ever met in any of the countries has this kind of heartbreak moment because of how close it all comes to having remained united just 1 year before partition takes place. I think it kind of falls apart in July 46. So 1 year, 1 month, essentially. Things could have all been very, very different. I think, yes, I think that there could have been some sort of united India. I think that the concerns of the Muslim League were very real and there was very much popular support for something, but I think that demand would have been somewhat solved by this kind of United Kingdom style situation. Ultimately, they were asking for, first and foremost, for political protection and making sure that the provinces were kind of gerrymandered essentially so that there would always be, a Muslim vote having some percentage of importance. The crucial thing that led to this whole mess was the fact that despite Muslims being 30% of the population, and despite there being more Indian Muslims at the time than there were Arab Muslims in the entire world, because India, Pakistan and Bangladesh were all one, in most districts, Muslims were 30%. Even though they were 30%, they didn't have a majority anywhere. So across the system, they were always losing every district election. And so what Jinnah initially asks for in the 1920s is essentially just a 30% reservation. And frankly, given the system of reservations that we're going on about right now, it doesn't actually sound nearly as preposterous as it sounded to many of the congressmen at the time. I think of all the characters in the book, Jinnah is the one who's most fascinating and most defied my expectations when I began researching, because the Jinnah of the 1910s and the Jinnah of the 1940s are so fundamentally different figures. Jinnah, although he never appears on our kind of, Azadi Kisanani lists of freedom fighters, if you asked anyone in the 1910s who they'd expect to be the leaders of an independent India, most people across the political divides said Jinnah. Jinnah was the biggest, highest congressman in the country. He was a guy who kind of, wore a suit and drank whiskey and ate pork and had a Parsi wife and was driving around fast cars in Bombay, chain smoking cigarettes. He's a very different man from the very stern figure with an Achkan hat, with an Achkan and a caracal hat that shows up in the kind of Pakistani banknotes today. And the political transformation and the personal transformation of Jinnah from the 1910s to the 20s to the 30s and the 40s is one of the most astonishing political transformations I think that the world has ever really seen, which makes it very difficult to talk in general senses about what Jinnah thought about stuff, because the early Jinnah, the middle Jinnah and the late Jinnah are so different from one another. But I think in the early days he is very much, essentially, he's regarded by Sarojini Naidu as the greatest ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. And he's given a trophy saying that. She actually wrote a book called The Ambassador of Hindu-Muslim Unity about Jinnah. And later, by 1946, she refers to him, like in the wake of Direct Action Day, she refers to him as Lucifer, the fallen angel who almost brought us to heaven, but instead brought us to hell. So, in some sense, her perspective tells us the whole story, but the scale of transformation of this man and the different demands that he makes at different times, I think is so important to understanding this whole situation. But yeah, thank you for that question. I think we've got one final question.
Backwards, but you're a fascinating storyteller. So if I just asked you to take a leap of faith and say, if you wrote a work of speculative fiction going back some years, and considering that currently where we are, India with all the AFSPA states, and then we have Bangladesh, we have Burma, and we have Pakistan, each having their different degrees of civil war or strife, what would your work of speculative fiction look like? Wow.
Well, I think that I can only speak to a sense of hope, I guess. So I entered this whole topic through an organization I co-founded with some Indian and Pakistani and Bangladeshi friends called Project Dastan, and we were working essentially to reconnect divided families with their old hometowns, with their old Haveli, or their old masjid, or mandir, or gurdwara, whatever it might be, their old school, their old sweet shop, the place they went on their first date. And we were using virtual reality to reconnect people across these borders, and often try to reconnect them with childhood friends. And I think the biggest takeaway that I got from that is...
You've got a photo for that, right? That virtual reality?
I don't, I think, in this particular presentation.
Okay.
But I think that the biggest takeaway that I had from that was unexpectedly a sense of hope. A sense that despite these wars, despite these divides, despite so much death and destruction, despite endlessly and increasingly scary times, you know, when Indians and Pakistanis go abroad to college in the UK, they're all best friends. They're all eating food together. They're listening to the same songs. They are, you know, often dating one another. And that's not the case between, say, you know, Russia and Ukrainians, or between kind of Israelis and Palestinians. That is a very unique thing for one of the most geopolitically volatile places on the planet. And I'm filled with a sense of hope. I'm filled with a sense of that there still today is this sense of cross-border friendliness and you know, love for one another on an individual level, even if the governments just kind of, you know, at war. And so I think that the speculative fiction would have been some sort of world. I mean, I'll tell you what it would be. So both Nehru and Aung San, the future Aung San Suu Kyi's father, you know, the founding father of Burma, they have this discussion in 1946, just before the Asian Relations Conference, where they pitch the idea of a United States of South Asia consisting of all of the former states of the former Raj, where basically, you know, monolithic identities wouldn't be imposed and where people would be allowed to have these kind of mixed cosmopolitan identities, but basically the Brits would be gone and there would be several smaller states that you know, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Burma, but being part of a kind of EU-like system. And I feel like that would be my work of speculative fiction, where these divides were not so wide as they are today.
Vote of thanks from Shubha.
Thank you very much, Sam. I think everyone here will agree that the session was instructive and absorbing, just like your book. But in the face of Sam's staggering erudition, the thought that struck me with great violence is how embarrassingly young he is. He mentioned that Calcutta is his favorite city, so I was trying to think of his age relative to events in Calcutta. And I realized, to my shock and horror, that he was born even after the Azharuddin Ranatunga semi-final at the Eden Gardens. And I must also add that despite your several learned references, I think the one that inspired the most number of nodding heads in the audience was your reference to Halim. So Ratcliffe, ঠিক আছে, Halim, you know, so, but many congratulations on a sparkling, sparkling debut. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much, Rudra, for carrying the proceedings. You're so much more eloquent when you're on stage than when you're not. But I think Rudra's singular achievement is even next to Sam, he looks so young. Thank you, Mrs. Malavika Banerjee, for helping us, as always, put this together. And thank you to our lovely and ever-reliable librarian, Mrs. Shebonti Sengupta. May I request Dr. Rudra Chatterjee to please felicitate Sam and Rudra. Sam Dalrymple.
So I can do Hindi and Urdu, and I can read Bangla script, but I can't get through all that. We can get the basic stuff, but then there was a lot of different languages I used in the course of research through friends who helped to translate stuff. Konyak, Burmese, Arabic.
We also have a gift for you, Sam. Thank you. And now, a bouquet for Rudra. Achha, of course. Mr. Rudra Chatterjee. Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening.